The NATO combat mission in Afghanistan ended 3 years ago, but the war is far from over, as I discovered visiting a British Air Force base at Kabul International Airport last week.
Casualties that we've heard of.
Down.
GPA's locked down.
NATO now plays a backseat role, helping train, advise and assist Afghan forces in their battle against the Taliban.
Suffice to say, there is some sort of barrage going on at the moment, but in terms of numbers, locations, we don't have that information at the moment.
But it's been a tough fight since the Afghans took over. The government now controls less than 2/3 of the country. And that is not the only challenge for Afghanistan. It's one of the most corrupt countries on earth. Tens of billions of dollars are reckoned to have been stolen by government officials. The country is also grindingly poor. No wonder the president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, says he's got the toughest job in the world.
President, very good to meet you. Very good. Thank you very much.
President Ghani, thank you very much indeed for sitting down to do this interview. You're one of the few world leaders who says he gets on with President Trump. What is it about Mr. Trump and about you that means that you two can do business together?
The first thing is shared interest. If you do not have shared interest, you cannot develop a common language. We are able to have a dialogue, not a monologue. And that has really been key. President Trump has been extraordinarily thorough in terms of the hard questions and the arguments that we were able to present were convincing that the engagement was because of US's interest, global interest, and then, of course, our interest, and we found the points of convergence.
So it was about presenting your case succinctly and persuasively.
Absolutely.
Now, the commitment that he's made to Afghanistan is significant. He's increased troop numbers, but more importantly, possibly, he said this is an indefinite commitment. We'll stay as long as it takes. What is Afghanistan going to do in return for that substantial commitment the Americans have made?
A total reform process. A comprehensive, holistic reform across the board involving the economy. We need to show that self-reliance are not words, but deeds. So because of that, regional connectivity, market orientation, developing of our natural resources, because fortunately, we are a potentially very rich country. A very focused and systematic reform of our security sector, governance, rule of law, and most importantly, of course, the empowerment of three majorities in this country: youth, women, and the poor. Because citizenship, this is a very young country. We are in ancient civilization, but an extraordinarily young country. So the generational transformation in terms of making sure that the generation of 1990s takes over authority and responsibility is crucial to this enterprise.
Well, look, there's a number of issues there. Let's break them down a bit, because one of the key issues for you, and indeed for President Trump, is the issue of corruption. The NATO powers, the West, has poured resources into Afghanistan. The estimates begin at $1 trillion. And looking at Afghanistan now, lots of people would say much of that money was wasted. It was stolen by corrupt officials. What are you going to do to begin to tackle corruption here?
The strategy against corruption is being finalized at the High Council on rule of law, good governance, and anti-corruption. I think the jury needs to look at it, but in comparative terms, this is probably one of the most thoroughly prepared anti-corruption strategies, because it does not just deal with symptoms. We're dealing with root causes. And also, we are not just dealing with prosecution, that is extremely important, but we are dealing with the fundamental ways of creating good governance. And moreover, this is not imposed. It's driven by us, it is thoroughly owned by us, and the generational transformation in leadership that is taking place will own and implement.
Go on.
The anti-corruption effort is being led by this man, Dodd Knorr. His work challenges some of the most powerful people in the country. He's an Afghan who was brought up in Germany but has returned to the country of his birth with a vision for change.
So, Dawood, this is the big reform meeting, yeah?
Yes, here we create actually the reform structures. It's the most important meeting.
Okay.
Hi guys.
So the idea is to open up the Afghan government to scrutiny, and that means allowing the decision-making processes of government to be audited. So that includes all the big high-spending departments that are all listed up there. But it also is about allowing ordinary citizens to hold the government accountable.
Office, please guys, can you put us in the next cabinet meeting?
Ashraf Ghani put him in charge of the administrative office of the president.
This is the ministry view. We create
It now has the power to audit government departments to root out corruption.
But the rest of the operation, right, down to the
But its agenda is much wider than that.
As I can see right now in my office, who's doing what on a minute base, working which tasks, which person works where. Basically, this e-government system allows me or anyone who is managing in it to see the operation of any co-worker.
So again, the core of this is transparency. It's about opening it up so everyone can see how decisions are being made and who's making what.
And, says Mr. Ghani, that applies across government.
There's an overarching reform of the recruitment process. Talk to our Civil Service Commission. They're empowered and they're being supported. I'm not interfering in a single process of selection. It is when they do the job, I sign.
So this is blind selection.
It's blind selection. We have the entire financial management part, administrative and financial part of the government subject to blind recruitment. 38,000 people have applied online. The Attorney General's office. We have an Attorney General that is determined, is well in capability, a 3-star general that I had promoted is now in prison because it was demonstrated that fuel was being stolen. One of the richest men in this country that people thought was untouchable is now in prison. And again, you can ask anybody in the judicial sector. I provide full political support, but I do not get involved in judicial.
What is the first principle of tackling corruption in your view?
Political will. The first principle is that you do not engage in it and you have the will to confront it. Whoever engages in corruption, regardless of affiliation, relationship, etc., must be subject to same law. The fundamental issue about corruption is not to be denied and to acknowledge that it's systemic. And when you realize it, then the strategy is not tactical. It has to deal with the fundamentals. And then there are indicators, global indicators on the basis of which.
Well, let me bring up the global indicators. You've been in power for 3 years now. Afghanistan isn't exactly racing up the rankings of Transparency International, is it? So why are we not seeing?
Because the problem was so vast and so systematic that we had to create the foundations. I think next year you will see change in numbers. And in the past, we first focused on things that were not in measurement. For instance, security sector. We focused in earnest on the security sector corruption because this was costing us lives in defense of our country. But we did it, I hope it's appreciated, in the middle of fighting a war. Please show me a country that has prosecuted senior military and police officials while fighting a war both against terrorism and...
Yeah, there's an inherent dilemma for politicians tackling corruption, and that is the more corruption you discover, the more corrupt your government looks. And that could be a liability for you going to the polls in 2 years' time, couldn't it? Isn't there a danger you create your own weakness by doing this?
No, I think this is an excuse. It's an excuse for not doing anything. Look, somebody has to bear the cost of change. Change is not pleasant to the entrenched interests. So they're going to scream murder. But if re-election is your goal, you're never going to engage in reform. Reform has to be your goal. Election is the means. You run for office in order to do something, not in order to perpetuate yourself. Politicians of the 20th century, late 20th century, have become extraordinarily conservative. But our times require imagination in bold action.
But the price of your commitment to the reforms could be your government, because as you say,
but this is a price I'm willing to pay.
You're willing to pay that price?
Absolutely. If I didn't, I wouldn't be in this position. This is the worst job on earth. No, it is. If I'm going to make it better for my successor, I need to have courage, conviction, and determination, and a sense of sacrifice.
And you're willing to make that sacrifice
Absolutely.
if it comes to it. Listen, let's move on to another really tricky issue for Afghanistan, security.
Security is still a huge issue here, as we discovered while we were out with British forces the day before we met Mr. Ghani. A small Royal Air Force squadron of Puma helicopters helped support the NATO effort to train and advise Afghan forces. It moves equipment and personnel around Kabul.
Well, obviously, we're facilitating so much of what goes on here. We're moving mentors around.
We had just interviewed the squadron leader in the airport complex when an alarm sounded.
Down.
GPA's locked down.
So we've been lying here now for about half an hour. The siren keeps going off repeatedly. The latest information we've got is that a number of missiles of some sort have hit the airfield.
Just try. Suffice to say, there is some sort of barrage going on at the moment, but in terms of numbers, locations, we don't have that information at the moment.
A total of 46 mortar rounds were fired into the international airport complex, damaging planes and helicopters and bringing down the ceiling of one building. It was the biggest and most sustained attack for years. No one was hurt at the airport, but one Afghan civilian was killed and several others injured in the effort to take out the Taliban position. The attack was yet more evidence of just what a formidable force the Taliban remain.
The long-term aim, and this is very explicit from Trump, the long-term aim is, of course, that NATO forces would completely withdraw from Afghanistan and the battle that you face would become one at your responsibility alone. Let me ask you this question. Mr. Trump has given you this commitment, President Trump has given you this commitment, indefinite commitment to stay here, but when do you think NATO troops will be able to withdraw from Afghanistan?
Well, there are two components. One is we have a 4-year security plan, and we are racing through it. Look at our Ministry of Defense now, and look at it 3 years ago. If you're talking about racing reform, Ministry of Defense is an illustration of this. Second, look about the management of the war. This year, the war is being superbly managed because we were like 12-year-olds taking over the responsibility of a 30-year-old, but we grew in the process. And now, in terms of management and leadership, things are really falling in place. There are changes in our inherent law that are going to make it more robust. Systems and processes are being created to support this. Within 4 years, we think our security forces would be able to do their constitutional thing, which is the monopoly, claim to the legitimate monopoly of power. But our struggle, our engagement with the international community is not confined to our security. It also has the global security component. So the counter-terror cooperation does not depend on us. It depends on the robustness, unfortunately, and the morphing of terrorist organizations that are transnational. That component depends on all of us to be able to continue.
But look, if we just look at the hard statistics last year, and I agree the campaign this year has been more successful, but look at the statistics last year. I mean, 7,000 ANA soldiers lost their lives, some 12,000 were injured, you had desertions. I mean, in effect, you lost 10% of your fighting force. No army can sustain losses like that indefinitely and continue to wage a successful war? I mean, are you telling me that the corner has been turned here?
Yes. Well, first, it breaks my heart. But please understand, over 110,000 NATO ISAF troops withdrew. They were suffering casualties in thousands. And we did it without the air support. We did it without the armors, etc., etc. We are a developing country army. But I'm extraordinarily proud of the sacrifice. And the reason it's changing is because recruitment is up. Every single person in the Afghan army, in police, in secret service is a volunteer. There's no obligatory recruitment. And because of that, and because of the things that are changing, is it difficult? Yes. But it's no longer impossible. In 2014, when I became president, it looked like an impossible task. Now it looks like a difficult task. And difficult is within our grasp.
You've said the Taliban does not have much support, and yet we see the Taliban extending the area it controls and contesting more territory in Afghanistan. If it doesn't have support, how can it possibly be doing that?
No, well, look at two things. One is that when you say it, it's controlling. It's not been able to take a single province. Its aim was to overthrow the government. It had two strategic aims: to overthrow the government or to create two political geographies. It has failed miserably in both of these aims.
Well, if you look at somewhere like Helmand, it virtually controls the entire province. I mean, it's only Lashkar that isn't.
No, of course, I'm not questioning that there's a contestation, but Helmand is a drug war. Taliban are the largest exporters of heroin to the world. Why is the world not focusing on heroin? Is this an ideological war or is this a drug war? Who is benefiting from this drug war? Can Helmand, the conflict in Helmand, be sustained a day without the heroin component? And unfortunately, the bulk of that profit goes to Europe.
You think the bulk goes to Europe?
The bulk of the profit goes to Europe. Look at the UNODC studies. The trafficking, because the largest consumers are in Europe, and today it's reaching the Canadian market. We have a serious component of transnational criminality, and this transnational criminality needs to be addressed.
You're absolutely right. It is not defined as a drug war. It's defined as
a
civil war within Afghanistan. You're saying it's not that.
It's not that. There are multiple components. We need a global dialogue on the responsibility of producers, processors, traffickers, and consumers. And this is important because it's really becoming a major problem. And unless I've learned enormous amount from Colombia, and I'm learning from Mexico. President Santos is an inspiration in a lot of ways, but the other component is also this criminalization of the economy needs to be addressed.
So you'd see the stronger parallel between, say, Colombia, which has fought, ostensibly a war against an insurgency, but actually which became, everyone recognized, a war about control of the profits of drugs. You're saying you're fighting a similar
parallels.
battle here.
They're very, very similar processes, because transnational terrorism and transnational criminality are reinforcing each other.
So are you looking to a similar solution that President Santos found in Colombia, where you draw the criminal element into government?
This is precisely one component, is a peace agreement with Taliban so we can create the legal economy. Fortunately, the natural resources of Afghanistan, if we focus on it and have the conditions of peace, would allow us an alternative.
You're talking about peace with the Taliban.
I am talking
President
about peace.
Trump is talking about victory, although he acknowledges victory might...
Both. But the
But
aim,
this is not victory that the West would understand in terms of...
No, but the whole aim, Secretary Mattis was extremely clear, President Trump has been clear, the whole aim of the strategy is to provide the ground for a political solution. And a political solution is a negotiated solution. The way, shape, or form of it may not be the classic peace agreements of 1990s, but we need to focus on this because we need to reduce violence. And it's imperative that the people are given a chance to live lives. We have been denied breathing space for 40 years. and an immense tribute to our people for their resilience. Any other society would have been completely broken.
So victory is actually peace.
Victory, the main victory is sustainable peace, not any peace. A peace within the framework of our constitution that enables all our people to participate and to overcome our past.
The development efforts that really seem to make a difference in a country are not the big, glamorous dam projects or road building projects or new power stations. The really effective measures seem to be things like educating women and female empowerment. Now, those are two things that Afghanistan has traditionally been extremely weak on. What are you doing to change that?
Well, first, I'm an illustration that educating a woman changes 5 generations. My grandmother was in exile in India, and when she returned, she made sure that all her 6 sons, her grandchildren, were educated. The value of women's education is immense. The counter side is that a female-headed household living in poverty condemns 3 generations to poverty. So it's absolutely essential. The good news is that our women now have voice in organization. They're strong, they're resilient, and we need to work with that resilience and increase it. And because they're one of the 3 numerical majorities of this country, without their empowerment, there will be no stability or prosperity in this country. We're doing everything we can.
But you faced resistance because this is a very, very
No, it's not.
traditional society.
It's not. I mean, that is highly exaggerated. I give you an example. I came after 24 years in 2001. And my first task was to design a program called National Solidarity, which empowered 34,000 villages. And I said women's councils must be created next to men's council. And all our foreign advisors were saying, this is a traditional society, you've been away for 24 years. I said, you didn't know my grandmother. This is not about imposing values on our women. It is working with them. And they have remarkable ways of, our nomadic women never wore a veil. They were traders. They had, in that context of the 17th and 18th century, millions of apps to trade. We have to avoid stereotyping. And in Kabul University in 1960s, 66 when I joined the university and then went for my studies abroad, the number of women were remarkable. You know, we've had women doctors, women judges, and particularly teachers. Women are the majority of our teachers. And now we're getting women entrepreneurs. And this is extremely significant because when women are empowered economically, our religion poses no obstacles. Our women had the right to property when Western women were denied it. Your women have had the right to property less than 120 years ago. Look at Virginia Woolf, 3 pennies. But our women had the right to property. The wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him, was the largest trader in Mecca, and he worked for her, not the other way around. So our tradition is important in this regard. We can build on a legacy. The point is to reveal the hidden history of the woman and to make sure that it is done with proper values and a sense of commitment. Malaysia provides examples, Indonesia provides examples. Now the rest of United Arab Emirates, Qatar, the majority of the university students in Qatar, for instance, are women. So there's a world to win, and they will be there.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.